Then there's another kasha which people ask, and that is the issue of Mesora. The issue of Mesora, where people say you cannot do a mitzvah that we do not have a direct tradition to be Mekayim. In other words, this is a mitzvah that hasn't been given over from generation to generation. We didn't receive it from our fathers, from our Rabbis. It's something that it's been lost, and it's re-emerging now. We're not Mekayim a mitzvah that we don't have a tradition how to be Mekayim. I mean, besides the fact that all those poskim that I mentioned that say that there's a chash that the Tekhelet will come back, it could come back. Obviously, that's not the halucha. The halucha is that you are Mekayim a mitzvah if it reemerges, even though it has been lost for numerous generations. So this whole premise is obviously not correct. I don't know on what basis one would make such a premise. Like, what kind of rule is that? I mean, we have rules in the Torah, and the Torah says all the mitzvahs that you have to do, and we have to do them. So somebody would say, well, even if we know how to be Mekayim this mitzvah, we know what the mitzvah is, but, it depends how we know. If the way we know how to do the mitzvah is because we heard it from our fathers, our Rabbis, then we should listen to the Torah and do what the Torah says. But if the way we know is through other ways, even though we know, we're sure, and there's no question about it, but I don't like the way you know. I don't like the way you found out what the Rabbi Shalom is telling you to do. Don't listen to him. You found out in the wrong way. And that's absurd. How could there be such a thing? There cannot be such a thing. There is no such thing. And that's why there were a lot of Gedolim that even when the Radzina discovered his Tekhelet, and he said for sure that his Tekhelet is Tekhelet, and there were a lot of Gedolim who didn't know, but they just said, something, if the Radzina says so, let's put it on, let's wear the Tekhelet just in case. They didn't have this idea that you need something has to be given over traditionally from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation. There is no such idea in Halucha. When we find sometimes an inyan of Mesora, we find in the Halucha of Oifis that the Mechaber talks about how there are simunim to know which Oifis, which types of poultry, which fowl are kusha. So there are 3 simunim to be able to tell what's kusha. And then you also have to know that it's not a doiris, that it's not a predator. So then there are another 2 simunim. And the Mechaber says if you have these simunim, you're allowed to eat it. And the Marshal is Michael even more. And he says that you don't even need all the 5 simunim. The original 3 simunim are enough. You could eat it. The Prichudish Paskins like the Mechaber. There are poskim who say you can go and eat it. The Ramu says, no, we do not eat birds without a Mesora. Unless we have a tradition where somebody knows its identity because they've been shown this bird from somebody of previous who knew the identity, you have to have a Mesora. So what do we have here? Why? Because it says, why is the Ramu say you have to be mach? We have 5 simunim. It says because it might be that you might make a mistake. Even after the simunim, maybe it's a predator. We found that there are certain birds which have these simunim, and they're not completely conclusive. They could still be a predator. So then it's not kusha. So it's obviously not it's not a species which is kusha. So this doesn't prove it enough. So we have here that simunim, a lot of poskim hold you're allowed to rely on it even to be Michael and to eat something, which we don't have to eat it. Doesn't say anywhere in the Torah that you have to eat this bird. It's not a mitzvah, it's not a chiyuv, but it's you're allowed to. Comes the Ramu and says, no, we should not eat it because, first of all, why should we be Michael? There's no chiyuv to eat it. And if we would eat it, we would turn out to be wrong. Then it would turn out that we're being oiva on an issa. We're eating something which is not kosher. So you want to take that idea and flip it and say that we should be Michael and not do a mitzvah out of a lack of Mesora. Here we have poskim that say that we could be Michael and eat something which is a rishis and not be concerned of a issa, even though we don't have a Mesora. The Ramu says we should be machim and we should be concerned of a issa. So you're going to take that to say that, therefore, we need a Mesora and we should be Michael and not be Mekayim a mitzvah when it has been clearly identified with proofs? So, in fact, this would be similar. Let's say somebody finds a bird which is kusha according to all of the simunim, but we don't eat it because we don't have a Mesora, so the Ramu says we don't eat it. So we have a mitzvah of shaliach haken. If you want to take the eggs or the young birds, you have to send away the mother. Would we be allowed to take the eggs of this bird that we have simunim that it's kusha, but we don't have a Mesora? Of course not, because it's probably kosher. We're just machma not to eat it, but we can't be Michael and say that you don't have to be mekayim shalach. There is actually a chief in Minchas Eluzah who goes through this shal. The reason he asks the question to begin with, it's totally not a question. Of course, we won't be Michael, but it says ve'es habunim tikach loch. So he says maybe it has to be the kind of bird that you'll actually end up being able to eat. And since for whatever reason it is, we won't eat it, so maybe the halucha doesn't apply. But he says no, if it's kusha, it applies. So here we are. We have tchailis. We've proven so. Someone says, don't be mekayim the mitzvah. We're going to be Michael, and we're going to not do a mitzvah. Even if it would be wrong, there would be no issa. It's not like eating taif and a bird. I mean, the Yeshiyas Malkai, who doesn't agree with the tchailis of the Radzina, says there's no harm in wearing it. You don't have to fight with somebody who put it on his tzitzis already because it lo yahayel. So it's no worse than tzitzis that are not dyed at all. It's still kusha as tzitzis as luva. So there's no downside. So on such a thing, you're going to say that you need a Mesora. This idea of a Mesora is brought in the name of the Bais Halevi. And the Bais Halevi is quoted in a letter that the Radzina had received. I don't know who wrote the letter, whether it was the Bais Halevi himself or a shliach. It says this. It says something totally different. It says that you're identifying the chaluzan as being the cuttlefish. That is a type of a creature that we've had all the time and has never been lost. So if you can explain to me why over all of the generations they did not have tchailis, what did you discover that wasn't known all along? Either you discovered the actual species, the actual chaluzine, or you discovered the way of dying. And tell me, what is it that you know how to do that we didn't know all along? If you can tell me that, then we will in fact be obligated. The Bais Halevi, he agrees he'll be obligated, but you have to explain, because if there is no answer to that question, then the fact that they didn't wear it all along means that they understood that the cuttlefish is not the chaluzan, because otherwise they would have worn it. So by that version of the words of the Bais Halevi, the way it's quoted in the letter that the Bais Halevi sent to the Radzina, obviously that doesn't apply to the Murex trunkers. We know very well what happened, that there was a decree by the Roman emperors that nobody's allowed to wear tchailis, and then over the generations, the entire art of dyeing with chaluzin got lost, as the Radva says, because they discovered cheaper ways of producing blue. Because obviously the color, I know there was the discussion earlier in this event about whether the tchailis that the Yidden use for tzitzis is the same as the tchailis that the Goyim used. Obviously, the Radvaz holds it was. He says that the fact that in the industry they no longer made tchailis, so therefore Yidden also don't have tchailis, because it's the same tchailis, and it became a totally lost art, because now we have cheaper and easier ways of producing the blue dye. So therefore it's gotten lost. We know exactly why it has gotten lost. First, there was a decree from the emperors, and we weren't allowed to wear it. And that's what we actually brought also in the Ben Yehuda. On the Gemuri says that there was a decree that the Yidden were not allowed to wear tchailis. He learns it from the Gemur. I'm not going to get into that. And we know historically there was a decree on all kinds of tchailis, all kinds of purpira dye. And that's why it got lost. It's very simple. So Bais Halevi would ask his question, what exactly happened and why did you reemerge now? What did you find out that we didn't know all along? We have a very clear answer to that question. There is another version of the words of the Bais Halevi, and that's something which is known in the family of the descendants of the Bais Halevi. In one of the Sfurim, which brings this idea from one of the descendants of the Bais Halevi, he writes this, and I'll quote it. She'ain rayis v'svuris yecholos lohichiach shim dova. Proofs and the svuris logic cannot prove anything. B'mile the shayche lemesoires shel sha'alovichu yagaitu. And something which applies to a tradition which comes under the category of sha'alovichu yagaitu. Ask your father, he'll tell you. Which means a mesoira from generation to generation. Sham, in those types of things. In other words, not every mitzvah is like that, but there are types of haluchas that are shaykh to the union of Mesora. There, ein hasvura machriya. A svura cannot be the deciding factor. Ki im, only ha-Mesora atzma. Only an actual tradition to say, kach ru yovas, that's what the father saw, v'kacho in hagit, and that's what we have to do. Now, This is brought in connection to the family of the descendants of the Beis Halevi, bring this in connection to Tekhelet. Let me say this. If there would be a cipher that would say, a cipher from the early Rishon that would say, and we have such svura, the cipher says that it is the Murex trunculus, it is the Pilpira, that's the Chaluzin of the Tekhelet, got lost, and if anyone can find it and figure out how to die with it and everything, then that's what was used for Tekhelet. That would certainly be a Mesora. That's somebody identifying it. I mean, we have to speak to him directly. What about on Zoom? I mean, is that good? And if we find it in a cipher, it's not good? What he says is, what this statement is, what do you mean, things that are shayich to sha'alu vichu yagayt? What does that mean? That means that when something needs a definition, we have a word, chaluzon. The word chaluzon has to be defined. So how am I going to know the definition of a word? The only way to know such a thing is by tradition. So someone's going to try to figure it out. This must be what the word chaluzon means. Because it says that the chaluzon is like the sea, it's like a fish, it's like this, it grows, the skin grows with it. Then, something, that must be the definition of the word chaluzon. The word chaluzon is a word that needs a definition. When you need a definition, it's not something that you can prove by proofs. It's something that you either know the definition or you don't know the definition. So how do you know a definition? Because it's been given over traditionally. It's a language, it's been used, it's a word. So that is the Mesora of it. But if you don't have that, then it's just trying to figure out and guess what could possibly be the definition of the word chaluzon. So he says things that are shaykh to shalav yichi yagaytru. There are certain things that need to be identified, and without a tradition, you can't identify them. So that was relevant to the chaluzin of the Radzina, because on the basis of certain simunim, he decided that a cuttlefish is the definition of the word chaluzin. We do not prove what the definition of the word chaluzin is from proofs and from simunim, because that would be, some sort of a svura. We have the definition of the word chaluzin, as I have discussed earlier. We know what the word chaluzin means. It's written in Sfurim, it's written in Rishonim, it's written in Achronim. We have Achronim who say that the Pilpir is the Tekhelet. That's a Mesora. That is Gedoyli Yisruel, clearly identifying and pinpointing and saying this is what it is. The Beis Halevi would certainly agree to that by all versions of the statement of the Beis Halevi.